Well, today is the concluding day of our stewardship focus, and typically on a day like this I would share about why investing in this local church is the best way that you can invest in the future. I would typically, on occasion like this, I would share about the good things that this church is doing, how we're making a difference in our local community and also in the world. I would maybe share some stories about a couple of people whose lives have been changed. I would share about how we're making a difference. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore what happened last week as well. Now, I don't change the focus of my sermon every time there's a tragedy. If I did, I would be doing that every week. And I know that there have been mass shootings before this, and I know that there will probably be some shootings after this. But a couple of things. Number one is that this one, for many of us, hits closer to home, because we're in church many times every week or every other week. We're here often. And you think about that, how many of you have thought to yourself many times, thank goodness I live in Iowa? Maybe not just for this, but just in general, right? No. But how many of you have thought, thank goodness I live in Iowa sometimes when things like this happen in other places, other parts of the world? Thank goodness I don't live in a metropolis. As we think about sometimes acts of terrorism. Well, if a terrorist is going to want to hurt a lot of people, probably not going to aim for Iowa. But, so we think, well, we're pretty safe here, and yet then something like that happens, and I know it wasn't in Iowa, but still, something like that happens in a town of 500 people, a church of about 50 in attendance, and you see that, it's not limited to any one geography, it's not limited to any one setting. It can happen anywhere, and so for some people, they might have a mental list in their mind of places not to go, and you can add church to that list. I wonder how many people were afraid to come this morning. I wonder how many people stayed home because they just couldn't bring themselves to come and worship 1 week afterwards when it's so fresh. It's hard. And I think that another reason, though, is why it hits close to home is because it's just too much, right? Too many times, too many different events, so close together. You have the Las Vegas one, you have this one, I think there was one in between there that was not quite as many, but still bad. It's just too much. And so you might have a lot of questions that you have, why would this happen? Which we ask about a lot of different things, but why wouldn't God stop these things? How can such evil exist in the world? How can I keep my family safe? How can Mike choose scriptures that talk about not worrying and not being anxious when there's so much to be worried and anxious about? I can't answer all those questions, but I want to look at the scriptures. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus tells us not to worry. But the first thing we have to remember, though, is that worry, he's talking about everything in general, but he's talking about money. In fact, right before he talks about worry, he talks about money. And so if you were listening to him speak, you would have that subject of money in mind as he talks about worry. The two are oftentimes connected. We worry about whether or not we're going to have enough. And oftentimes what happens naturally is that when we worry about whether or not we have enough money, we tend to become less generous, and we tend to not want to give to help others because we want to make sure we have enough ourselves. And when we worry less about that, we tend to become more generous and to give more to help others. That's the way it works. But the thing is, there's a difference between concern and worry. Concern is what happens when you you're not sure what's going to happen. You want to put something in place to make sure that you plan. So concern is fruitful because it leads you maybe to make plans, and specifically when we're talking about money, you can plan, you can take some steps, you can try to plan so that what you're concerned about doesn't take place. But what happens oftentimes is that concern turns into worry. And the difference is that whereas when you're concerned about something, you don't lose sleep over it. When you worry about something, you can't not think about it. It invades your mind. and it's invading your life, and maybe you do lose sleep over it. Worry is fruitless because it doesn't do any good. Usually we worry about things we have no control over. If we could control whatever it was, we wouldn't be worrying about it. We might be concerned and we might do something to plan ahead, but we wouldn't be worried if we had control over it. We worry about the things that there's nothing we can do about, or very little, to be sure that what we're worried about doesn't happen. And so that's why worry itself is fruitless. In fact, it can be detrimental to our health. As Jesus said, it doesn't add an hour to our life. But hear what Jesus did not say. Jesus did not explicitly say that worry is sinful. Sometimes we hear that it is sinful because in a way we're distrusting God when we worry, and I can see that. But he didn't say that it's sinful, and he also was speaking in the context of money. But nonetheless, the trajectory of the Bible is that we are called not to worry about anything at all, which is a pretty radical thing to ask somebody. The Apostle Paul says, do not be anxious about anything, but when you're anxious or worried, pray to God, and God will give you peace. Of course, nowadays prayer is a dirty word. As after tragedies, people often say our prayers are thoughts are with you, and one person commented, well, prayers didn't help the people who were killed last Sunday, and prayers probably won't prevent another mass shooting from happening. Well, they might be right. That doesn't make prayer useless, but they might be right. And so, as we look at Paul, he seems to almost be giving this cliche advice. You worried? Pray about it. God will give you peace. You know? Well, thanks, Paul. That didn't really help. You ever had somebody tell you when you're worried about something, they just say, oh, don't worry about it. Does that help you? Oh, thank you. I didn't think about that. It never helps. It never helps. And we think, what were Jesus and Paul thinking? You know, they must have been living in La La Land or something to think that we just not worry or be anxious about anything. And yet, these men, Jesus did not grow up with rose-colored picture of the world by any means. Before he was old enough to remember, his parents had to flee and live as refugees in Egypt because the king was going to kill every baby age 2 and under. When he lived his whole life under the oppression of Rome, even though the scriptures promised that they would be free. His 12 closest friends, Judas, one of them, betrayed him, and the others all deserted him when he needed them most. His friend and relative, John the Baptist, was imprisoned for offending the king, and even though people prayed for him to be released, he was beheaded. And Jesus himself went through violence and was nailed to the cross. There's not a rose-colored view of the world. So when Jesus says not to worry, he knows what he's talking about. The Apostle Paul, same thing. You know, the Apostle Paul, he was persecuted often for his faith. And in fact, the letter to the Philippians that has that saying in it was written while he was in jail and not sure if he would ever get out or not. So talk about being anxious. So, you see, they have authority from which they speak. You know, words have a lot of weight to them when you know who said them and what they've done. Sometimes scriptures can become cute cliche sayings that's suitable for bumper stickers and home decor. And sometimes we can just take them out of context and we forget who said them and what the context was in which they said them. And when we find out, wow, you know, those words hold a lot more weight to them than they did before we knew that. You see, we are called to be a people of hope. And it doesn't make sense, and it's not supposed to make sense. We are called to be a people of stubborn hope, not regardless of the evidence. We are called to be a people who, for one thing, we know that when we read the news, it gives us a slanted, negative view of the world. It's easy to become depressed watching the news. And, you know, they're just doing their job, and they're doing the stories that get the ratings, and there's plenty of material, right? But we know that there's a lot of good in the world, too, that never gets reported. We can look at church history, and we can see examples of people who have continued to live in faith in the midst of extreme evil. I think of a woman who, her name is Perpetua, and she was alive during the turn of the 3rd century. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she was growing up we don't know when she was born, but we know she died in the year 203, right? This is a long time ago. And we don't know a lot about her life, but we know some of her last days from her diary and the diary of some others who were in prison with her. She and some friends of hers were going through a class that would lead up to baptism. So they were new Christians. And the emperor of Rome at the time, Severus, he was cracking down on Christianity because he saw it as being an affront to Roman patriotism. And so he wanted to cripple Christianity. And so he calls in these people, not just them, but he calls in Perpetua and her friends and her slave, right? This is a different world, obviously. He calls them in, and they say that they are Christians, they're asked, and they refuse to sacrifice to the emperor. And so they're put in prison. Well, her father comes to her and pleads with her. He is a pagan, which means he's not a Christian. And he pleads with her. The answer is simple to him. Just tell him you're not a Christian. Do the sacrifice. Go free. You know? And he's pleading with her. Do it for me. Do it for my sake. Do it for the sake of your son. He'll die without you. But she says, what is this? And she just points to an object. What is that? He says, it's a vase. And can we call it by any other name? No. Well, in the same way, I cannot be called by any other name than what I am, a Christian. Later on, she and her friends go before the governor, and the governor gives them one last chance. And as she is asked the question, her father comes barging in again. And he's got her son, who she's still breastfeeding. She has her son, and he has her son. And he pleads with her again, let go of your pride. Think of me in my old age. Think of your aunt. Think of your son. Have pride, just lay it down. And she doesn't. She says, I can't. And so she and her friends and her slave are sent to the arena. And when they go out into the arena, they see gladiators and wild animals, and it's not very long. A wild heifer comes and charges at them. She's thrown in the air, lands on her back. They're in these belted tunics. And so she gets up and she straightens her tunic, and then a leopard comes at them, and eventually the crowd gets tired of it and impatient, and so they call for their deaths. And so she and her friends and her slave are killed by a sword. What a story. Brutal, terrifying, inspiring, all wrapped up into one. This is just one example of many people who gave up their lives for the faith during this time period. I tell you this story to remind you that Christianity is not a form of escapism from the world. Christianity is not a crutch for those who can't handle the problems and the reality of the world. Christianity is not just for weak people, right? Christianity is for those who are stubbornly hopeful in the midst of extreme evil. Christianity is for those who understand the fact that we are strongest when we are weak, and that through our serving others and our lowering of ourselves, we actually are raising ourselves up. I tell you these stories because as we talk about being a people of hope and believing that goodness is greater than evil, we are called to do that in the way that we live our lives. As I said, the people at the Baptist Church in Texas are having worship today in a community center, and there are other people, not just them, but there are other people joining them, other pastors as well. I don't know if some churches canceled their services or what to join them, but the pastor himself is also there, and he's going to speak. Now you can ask yourself, is that really good to do that soon? They've lost half their congregation. The pastor's family lost their daughter. Are they ready for that already? And you can give a convincing argument for both. But I think that if they are able to do it sounds like they have a lot of support, but if they are able to do it, it is an admirable act of resistance. Because I highly doubt that the shooter thought that there would be worship 7 days later. I highly doubt that the shooter thought that that church would even continue on. Count me as one who thought, after something like that, I didn't know that the church would be able to continue on. And yet here they are. They're worshiping maybe now as we speak. They're worshiping. And, what a show of solidarity, what a show of resistance against evil. And indeed, when we worship, when we pray, when we study Scripture, when we give, it's an act of resistance. It's a way of saying that no, evil is not going to win. Goodness is greater than evil. Love is greater than hate. We refuse to respond to hatred with hatred. We refuse to feed into the energy of division that happens so often in our world and in our society. We refuse to see people who disagree with us as less than human. We refuse to throw back at people what they throw at us. We're saying enough. We are a people of love. We are a people of mercy. We are a people of hope. Jesus himself, when he died on the cross, a lot of people had their answer to the problem of Rome. Jesus' answer was kind of weird. I'll let myself be killed by Rome. That's strange, isn't it? And of course we know what happened on the third day. Jesus rose from the dead, but nonetheless, he allowed himself to be killed by Rome. The ironic thing is that whereas many people led revolts against Rome and they were, obviously didn't survive, Jesus succumbs to the violence. He says, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to keep this cycle of violence going. You want to do your worst to me, go ahead. And we saw the worst of humanity on Jesus on the cross. And we were at the same time shamed and also in awe. In awe of the depth of God's love for us. And the ironic thing is that 300 years later, roughly, Christianity became the official religion of Rome. Talk about irony. The very people that were trying to squash it. And so today we continue the example of Jesus. We see the sign of the cross. The sign of the cross is everywhere. It's in the church, of course, but we see it everywhere in other cases. May we see the cross as a symbol of a different way of living. May we see the cross as a sign that there is a better way than hatred. There is a better way than violence. There is a better way than so much of the negative things that are happening in our world. And may we resist, and may we be a people of hope. May we shine the light in the darkness. May we tell people why there's a reason that they have hope. Because that's what the world needs most, especially during times like this. We have a story to tell. We have hope to share. So may we share it and be a blessing to the world. In Jesus' name. Amen.